Get your hands off that patient. You're not authorized to touch him. Someone call security and get this woman out of my ER." The words cut through the noise of Bell Wow 4 like a scalpel through skin. Dr. Preston Hale did not lower his voice. He did not pull her aside. He said it in the middle of the trauma bay, in front of 2 residents, a respiratory tech, a charge nurse at the station, and a family of 4 pressed against the far wall with their hands over their mouths. He said it the way a man says something he has said before and expects no argument. The woman he was speaking to did not flinch. She stood at the head of the gurney, gloved hands resting at her sides, her eyes steady on the patient's airway. She was wearing navy scrubs. Her badge was clipped to her left breast pocket. Her name was Camille Okafor, and she had said exactly 4 words before Dr. Hale arrived. 4 words to the resident, quiet and precise, about the patient's oxygen saturation and the positioning of his neck. 4 words, that was all. Dr. Hale had walked in mid-sentence, taken one look at her, and made his decision in the space of a breath. "Stay in your lane," he said, "and find out where that lane is before you set foot in my department again." The charge nurse at the station looked down at her keyboard. The 2 residents looked at the floor. The respiratory tech took a single step backward, as if distance might provide cover. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Dead silence. What Dr. Preston Hale did not know, what none of them in that room knew, was who Camille Okafor actually was. What she had done. What she had built. What she carried in that badge clipped quietly to her pocket. Stay with this one to the end. Every detail is here for a reason. And when the truth came out, it did not just embarrass him. It ended him. But before we get there, let me take you back to the beginning. Now, here's what most people didn't know about Camille Okafor. She was born in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Delmar Boulevard in St. Louis, Missouri, in the winter of 1981. Her mother, Adeyeze Okafor, worked the overnight shift at Barnes Jewish Hospital as a nursing aide for 22 years, coming home in the gray light of early morning smelling of antiseptic and institutional soap, her shoes worn at the heel, her hands chapped from the latex gloves she pulled on and off 100 times a shift. Adeyeze never complained about the work. She complained, sometimes, about the way the work was received, the way certain doctors looked through her when she spoke, the way certain charge nurses handed her the tasks no one else wanted, and then forgot to write her name on the chart. But she never complained about the work itself. "The patient doesn't care what they think of you," Adeyeze told Camille once, when Camille was 9 years old and sitting on the edge of the kitchen table watching her mother wrap her sore feet. "The patient only cares what you do for them, so you stay low, you build high, and you let the work speak when the time comes." Camille held those words the way you hold something small and dense, something you do not fully understand yet, but know enough to keep. She was a quiet child and a quieter student. Not invisible, her teachers noticed her, the ones who were paying attention. She had a particular quality that some people mistake for shyness and others recognize as discipline. The ability to observe without announcing herself, to absorb without reacting, to hold a problem in her hands and turn it slowly until she found the place where it gave way. Her high school biology teacher, Mr. Everett Cole, wrote in her college recommendation letter that she had the most precise clinical instinct he had ever seen in a 17-year-old student. He meant it as a compliment. He did not know then how precisely accurate he was. She attended the University of Missouri on a full academic scholarship. Graduated summa cum laude with a degree in biochemistry. enrolled at Washington University School of Medicine the following fall. She was one of 4 black women in her class of '96. She did not make a ceremony of that fact. She simply worked. She worked with the focused, unhurried intensity of someone who understood that the ground beneath her was not guaranteed, and that the only thing she could control was the quality of what she built on it. She matched at Johns Hopkins for her residency in emergency medicine, completed a fellowship in critical care, published 3 peer-reviewed studies on airway management in polytrauma patients before she turned 35, was appointed attending physician at Mercy General Hospital in Chicago in 2017, was named director of the emergency department in 2021, a position she held quietly without press releases or profiles in hospital newsletters, because she had not built her career for the profile. She had built it for the work. On the morning that Dr. Preston Hale told her to stay in her lane, Camille Okafor was not a float nurse. She was not an agency fill-in. She was not a nursing student on rotation or a volunteer from a community health program. She was his department's director. She had been for 3 years. She had hired 2 of the residents standing in that room. She had approved the protocols that governed every clinical decision made in Bay 4. She had simply been working a shift on the floor that morning because one of her attending physicians had called out sick, because that was the kind of director she was, and because she had learned from her mother that the work did not diminish you. He did not recognize her. He had never looked closely enough to recognize her. That was the beginning of everything that followed. Now, let me show you the man who stood across from her. Dr. Preston Hale was 51 years old, and he had spent most of those years in rooms where his arrival changed the temperature. He was tall, broad-shouldered, silver at the temples in a way that photographed well. He had graduated from Northwestern's Feinberg School of Medicine in 1998, completed his residency at Rush University Medical Center, and been hired at Mercy General in 2004. He was a skilled emergency physician. That was not in dispute. His hands were steady, his diagnostic instincts were sound, and in a genuine trauma, he was the person you wanted in the room. But Dr. Hale had also spent 20 years accumulating a particular kind of certainty, the certainty of a man who had rarely been wrong in a room and had therefore concluded that he was rarely wrong. He moved through Mercy General's emergency department the way a property owner moves through his own house, with the unhurried authority of someone who does not need to announce himself because the space already knows him. The residents deferred to him. The nurses worked around his preferences. The charge nurses had learned over years which battles were worth fighting and which were not. He had opinions about who belonged in certain spaces. He did not articulate those opinions directly. He did not need to. They lived in the way he looked at people, in the fraction of a second before his face settled into its professional register, in the small adjustments he made to his tone, depending on who was speaking to him and what they were wearing and what their badge said and what they looked like. He was not the kind of man who would have described himself as prejudiced. He was the kind of man who had simply never been required to examine the architecture of his assumptions. The dramatic irony of that morning was this. The woman he dismissed in front of a room full of witnesses was the woman who signed his performance reviews. She was the woman who had approved his last contract renewal. She was the woman whose name appeared above his on the department's organizational chart and had for 3 years, and he had never once registered it. He had seen her in the department. He had seen her at the nursing station. He had, on at least 2 occasions, handed her a chart without looking at her face, the way you hand something to a person you have already categorized. He had categorized her wrong. and it was about to cost him everything. The morning of the incident began the way most Tuesday mornings in the Mercy General Emergency Department began, with the smell of burnt coffee from the break room, the low percussion of monitors, and the particular quality of fluorescent light that makes every surface look equally exhausted. The department had been running at capacity since 6 a.m. 2 attending physicians were on the floor. Camille had come in at 7 to cover the gap left by Dr. Anita Reyes, who had called in with a fever at 5:30 that morning. Camille did not announce herself as director when she came onto the floor. She never did. She pulled on her gloves, clipped her badge to her pocket, and began working. She had been managing Bay 3 when the call came in from the ambulance bay. A 17-year-old male, unrestrained passenger in a high-speed collision. Suspected cervical injury, GCS of 12 and dropping. She moved to Bay 4 before the gurney arrived. The patient came in on a backboard, neck in a collar, an EMT calling out vitals in the flat, rapid cadence of someone who has delivered bad news before. Camille assessed in seconds. The boy's airway was compromised. His oxygen saturation was falling. She told the resident, Dr. Marcus Webb, 26 years old, 6 months into his first year, to prepare for intubation and to adjust the positioning of the cervical collar by 2 centimeters to the left. 4 words of instruction: quiet, precise, correct. That was when Dr. Preston Hale walked through the door. He took in the room in a single sweep. He saw a black woman in navy scrubs standing at the head of the gurney, issuing instructions to his resident. He did not look at her badge. He did not ask her name. He did not pause. He spoke. "Get your hands off that patient. You're not authorized to touch him. Someone call security and get this woman out of my ER." Dr. Marcus Webb went still. The respiratory tech, a young man named Darius Cole, took that single step backward. The charge nurse at the station, Patricia Osei, looked up from her keyboard with an expression that moved through recognition and landed somewhere between dread and calculation. Patricia had worked at Mercy General for 11 years. She knew exactly who Camille Okafor was. She knew exactly what she was watching. She looked down at her keyboard. Camille did not raise her voice. She did not move her hands from their resting position at her sides. She looked at the patient, the boy, 17 years old, whose oxygen saturation was now reading 89. And she said calmly to Dr. Webb, "His SAT is dropping. Prepare the laryngoscope." Dr. Hale stepped forward. "I said, step away from the patient." "Stay in your lane," he said again, and this time there was something harder underneath the words, something that had nothing to do with clinical protocol. "And find out where that lane is before you set foot in my department again." Patricia Osei's hands were flat on the desk. She was not typing. She was not moving. She was doing the calculation that people do when they understand the cost of speaking and the cost of silence and are trying in real time to determine which costs they can live with. She never raised her voice. She never moved toward the door. She stayed at the head of that gurney, and she watched the boy's chest, and she waited. The room waited with her. And then the boy's monitor alarm sounded. Saturation, 84. Heart rate climbing. The resident looked at Dr. Hale. Dr. Hale looked at the monitor. For exactly 3 seconds, the most experienced physician in the room was the one who had just been told to leave it. Camille reached for the laryngoscope. She did not ask permission. She did not explain herself. She moved with the unhurried, absolute precision of someone who had performed this procedure 412 times, in conditions ranging from a controlled trauma bay to the back of a field tent in Port-au-Prince in 2010 during a medical mission she had never mentioned to anyone at Mercy General. The tube was placed in 11 seconds. Clean. Correct. The saturation began to climb. The room was very quiet. Dr. Hale stood at the foot of the gurney. His arms were at his sides. His face had not changed exactly, but something behind it had shifted. A small, almost invisible recalibration. Like a man who has just placed his foot on ground he expected to be solid and found it give slightly beneath him. He did not apologize. He did not speak. Patricia Ose was already reaching for her phone. She did not call security. She called the department administrator's office on the 4th floor. She asked for Dr. Linda Marsh, Mercy General's chief medical officer. She said 4 words into the receiver before Dr. Marsh picked up. "You need to come down." Patricia Ose had worked at Mercy General for 11 years. She had watched things happen in that department that she had not reported, not because she did not care, but because she had learned over time what the cost of caring looked like when you were a black woman in a support role at a hospital where the physician set the temperature. She had made accommodations. She had made calculations. She had looked down at her keyboard more times than she could count. Not this time. She had watched Camille Okafor save that boy's airway while the attending physician who had dismissed her stood at the foot of the bed and did nothing. She had watched the room freeze. She had watched the residents look at the floor. And she had understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the accommodation she made in the next 60 seconds would define something about her that she was not willing to have defined that way. So she made the call. Dr. Linda Marsh arrived in Bay 4 7 minutes later. She was 63 years old, white-haired, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have been in authority long enough to stop performing it. She walked through the door, looked at the room, looked at Camille, looked at Dr. Hale, and looked at the boy on the gurney whose oxygen saturation was now reading 97. She said nothing for a moment. Then she said quietly to Dr. Hale, "Come with me." He went. The hallway outside Bay 4 smelled of antiseptic and something older. The particular staleness of a corridor that has absorbed decades of difficult conversations. Dr. Linda Marsh walked ahead of Dr. Preston Hale without looking back at him, which was itself a kind of statement. Her shoes made a clean, unhurried sound on the linoleum. His made no sound at all, because he had stopped walking. "Dr. Marsh," he said, "I want to be clear about what happened in there. There was an unauthorized individual at the patient's head, and I know what happened," she said. She had not turned around. He followed her into the small consultation room off the main corridor, the one with the round table and the single window that looked out onto the parking structure. She closed the door. She did not sit. She stood at the window with her back to him for a moment, and in that moment Dr. Preston Hale felt something he had not felt in a very long time in this building. He felt the ground give. "Preston," Dr. Marsh said, turning, "tell me what you know about the woman you just had removed from Bay 4. He opened his mouth. He closed it. She was in navy scrubs, no white coat. She wasn't wearing a... He stopped. "I didn't see a physician's badge." "She was wearing her badge," Dr. Marsh said. "She wears it every day, on her left breast pocket." He said nothing. "Her name is Dr. Camille Okafor," Linda Marsh said. "She is the director of your emergency department. She has been for 3 years. She came in this morning to cover Anita Reyes's shift, because that is the kind of physician she is, and because she built this department from the ground up. and because she does not ask anyone to do work she is not willing to do herself. She paused. She also just placed a perfect intubation in 11 seconds on a hypoxic 17-year-old while you were standing at the foot of the bed telling her to step away. The fluorescent light in the consultation room was the same light as everywhere else in the hospital. Flat, unsparing, it showed everything. Dr. Hale's face had gone very still. "I want a full written account of the incident on my desk by end of day," Dr. Marsh said. "And I want you to understand something, Preston. What I watched happen in that room, what the residents watched, what the family watched, what the charge nurse watched, that is not a correctable error. That is a pattern. And I have been watching it for longer than today." She opened the door. She said one more thing before she walked out. "The boy is stable because of her." Then she left him there. And the reckoning had not even started yet. Now, here is what most people did not know about what happened in the hours that followed. Dr. Marcus Webb, the first-year resident who had frozen at the gurney, went home that evening and did not sleep. He was 26 years old, the son of a Haitian-American electrician from Evanston and a schoolteacher who had told him since childhood that the most dangerous thing a person could do in the presence of injustice was nothing. He had done nothing. He had stood in Bay Fair with his hands at his sides and watched a woman with more knowledge, more skill, and more institutional authority than anyone else in the room be publicly stripped of all three. And he had looked at the floor. He did not look at the floor the next morning. He walked into the department administrator's office at 7:45 a.m. and asked to give a formal statement. He said he wanted it on record. He said he wanted his name attached to it. The administrator, a careful man named Gerald Fitch, who had worked at Mercy General for 19 years, looked at him across the desk with an expression that was equal parts respect and concern, and he said, "You understand what you're doing?" "Yes," Marcus Webb said. He said it the way his mother had taught him to say things that needed to be said, plainly, without decoration. His statement was 3 pages long. It named every person present. It described every word that was spoken, in order. It included his own failure to act, written in the same plain language as everything else, because he had decided that the only honest accounting was a complete one. He signed it. And he was not the only one. Darius Cole, the respiratory tech who had taken that single step backward, filed a statement the same afternoon. He was 23 years old and had been at Mercy General for 14 months. He had a student loan the size of a small mortgage and a supervisor who had told him, when he was hired, to keep his head down and learn the rhythms of the department before he made any waves. He had kept his head down. He had learned the rhythms. And he had watched those rhythms produce the morning of Bay 4, and he had understood, with the particular clarity of a young man who is done making the same calculation, that keeping his head down was no longer something he was willing to do. His statement was 1 page. It contained 12 sentences. Every one of them was true. Patricia Osei had already given hers. 3 statements, 3 witnesses, 3 people who had been in the room and had chosen, each in their own time and at their own cost, to say what they saw. Now, here is what most people did not know about the investigation that followed. Dr. Linda Marsh did not move quietly. She moved with the deliberate, unhurried authority of a woman who had been waiting for a reason to move and had finally been given one she could not ignore. She convened a formal review board within 48 hours of the incident. She requested the department's incident logs for the previous 3 years. She asked for every written complaint, every informal grievance, every note filed by a nurse or a tech, or a resident about interactions with Dr. Preston Hale that had been logged and then, in the particular way of institutions that protect their own, quietly filed away without action. There were 11 of them. 11 separate documented instances, spread across 3 years, in which Dr. Hale had spoken to or acted toward a colleague in a way that a reasonable observer would have described as dismissive, demeaning, or discriminatory. 7 of those instances involved colleagues of color. 4 involved women. 3 involved both. None of them had resulted in formal discipline. Several of them had been marked resolved informally by a department supervisor who no longer worked at the hospital. The review board sat for 4 days. Camille Okafor appeared on the second day. She sat at the table in a white coat, her badge on her left breast pocket, and she answered every question she was asked with the same measured precision she brought to everything else. She did not editorialize. She did not express anger. She did not ask for anything beyond an accurate account of what had occurred. When the board chair, a pulmonologist named Dr. Raymond Chu, asked her how she had felt when Dr. Hale told her to step away from the patient, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I felt the patient's saturation dropping. That was what I felt." 8 words. The board chair wrote them down. She said one more thing before she left the room. She said it without being asked because she had decided it needed to be said. The residents in that bay were watching. They are going to be physicians for the next 30 or 40 years. What they learn about how authority is exercised in this department, what they learn is acceptable. What they learn goes unchallenged. That will shape every patient they ever treat. That is what this is about. Not me. She stood. She thanked the board. She walked out. The door closed behind her. Dead silence. On the 4th day, the board issued its findings. Dr. Preston Hale was placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full disciplinary review. The hospital's legal counsel was notified. The 11 prior complaints were formally reopened. A letter was sent to the Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation, which licenses physicians in the state, documenting the incident and the board's findings. It was not revenge. It was a record, and records in institutions are the architecture of consequence. Dr. Hale hired an attorney. The attorney issued a statement saying his client disputed the characterization of events and looked forward to presenting his account to the appropriate bodies. The statement was 4 paragraphs long and used the word context 7 times. The board's findings were 4 sentences long. They did not use the word context once. The disciplinary review concluded 6 weeks later. Dr. Preston Hale's contract with Mercy General Hospital was not renewed. The decision was made by the hospital's board of directors in a closed session that lasted 40 minutes. The vote was unanimous. He was not fired in anger. He was not fired with ceremony. He was simply informed, by letter, that his services would no longer be required and that the hospital wished him well in his future endeavors. He had worked at Mercy General for 20 years. It ended in a letter. Patricia Osei received a formal commendation from the hospital's administration 2 weeks after the review concluded. It was the first formal commendation she had received in 11 years of service. Dr. Marsh presented it to her personally, in the break room, in front of the department staff, and said that the kind of courage Patricia had shown on the morning of the incident was not a small thing, that it was, in fact, the kind of thing that determined what a hospital actually was, beneath its protocols and its organizational charts and its mission statements. Patricia accepted the commendation with her hands folded and her expression steady. She did not cry. She had done her crying in private the night after she made the call, when she sat in her car in the parking structure for 20 minutes before she could drive home, because she had understood what she had put at risk and had done it anyway, and the weight of that understanding had to go somewhere. Marcus Webb was not disciplined for his statement. He was, in the weeks that followed, quietly assigned to work more shifts under Camille's direct supervision, not as a punishment, but because she had asked for it. She had read his statement. She had noted its honesty, including the part about himself. She had decided that a resident willing to put his own failure on the record was a resident worth teaching carefully. She never told him she had read it. She simply showed up to his shifts, asked him questions, and watched him grow. Darius Cole kept his job. His supervisor, the one who had told him to keep his head down, was later transferred to a different department as part of a broader restructuring that followed the review. Darius was not restructured. He was, as far as anyone could tell, exactly where he had always been, at his station, doing his work, with his head at exactly the height he chose to hold it. Now, here is what most people did not know about the weeks that followed. The story did not stay inside the hospital. It rarely does when the facts are plain enough and the witnesses are willing. A healthcare industry newsletter published a brief account of the disciplinary action. No names, but enough detail that people who worked in Chicago's hospital system understood exactly what it described. A physician advocacy group that focused on equity in medical institutions cited the case in a formal letter to the Illinois Hospital Association, calling for standardized protocols requiring ID verification before any physician is challenged in a clinical setting. The letter was signed by 47 physicians. Camille Okafor's name was not on it. She had not been asked to sign it, and she would not have signed it if she had been asked, because she had not built her career to become a symbol. She had built it for the work. But the letter cited her case. And the Illinois Hospital Association, after a review that took 3 months and involved input from 17 member institutions, adopted a new standard of practice. Any challenge to a clinician's authority in a patient care setting must be preceded by a request for identification, and any clinician who issues such a challenge without that step is subject to formal review. It was not named after her. She had not asked for it to be. But it existed, and it would govern emergency departments across the state for years to come. The ground had shifted, not with anger, not with revenge, with a record and a room full of witnesses, and a woman who had stayed at the head of that gurney and watched a boy's saturation climb back to 97. That was the architecture of it. That was how it was built. Now, here is what most people did not know about the months that followed the review board's findings. The months in which the full weight of what had happened in Bay 4 continued to settle. The way weight always settles, not all at once but in layers, each one pressing down on the one beneath it until the structure either holds or gives way. Dr. Preston Hale's contract termination was not the end of his accounting. It was the beginning of it. The Illinois Department of Financial and Professional Regulation opened a formal inquiry into his licensure within 3 weeks of receiving the hospital's letter. The inquiry was not a small procedural matter. It was a full review, the kind that requires a physician to appear before a licensing board and answer, on the record, for a documented pattern of conduct that had been witnessed, reported, and substantiated by 3 independent parties. His attorney filed motions. The motions were considered. They did not change the timeline. He appeared before the board on a Tuesday morning in March. The hearing room was small and fluorescent and entirely without sympathy. He sat at a table in a gray suit, his silver temples catching the light, and he answered questions for 4 hours. The board had the 11 prior complaints. They had the 3 witness statements. They had the review board's findings. They had the letter from Mercy General's board of directors. They had, most significantly, a transcript of his own written account of the incident, the one he had submitted to Dr. Marsh by end of day, as she had asked, in which he had used the phrase unauthorized individual 4 times and had not once mentioned asking for identification. He had said what he saw, he had not seen clearly, and the record said so. The board voted to suspend his medical license for 1 year, with reinstatement contingent on the successful completion of a mandatory bias and professional conduct training program. It was not a revocation. It was not a criminal proceeding. But a physician without a license is not practicing medicine. And a physician who has been suspended by a state licensing board carries that fact with him into every subsequent application, every future hospital credentialing review, every professional reference check for the rest of his career. It was institutional consequence, precise, proportionate, permanent in its record, if not in its duration. He left the hearing room without speaking to the press. There was no press statement. There was no further attorney's statement using the word context. There was only a man in a gray suit walking through a parking lot in March, and the particular silence of someone who has finally understood the size of what they did not see. He had spent 20 years in rooms where his arrival changed the temperature. He did not change the temperature of that parking lot. And that was the reckoning, not with anger, not with revenge, with a record and a board and the accumulated weight of 11 documented instances and 3 witnesses who had chosen, each at their own cost, to say what they saw. Patricia Osei received a promotion 4 months after the review concluded. She was named lead charge nurse for the emergency department, a role that came with a salary adjustment, a formal title, and the kind of institutional recognition that had been withheld from her for 11 years while she had done the work anyway. Dr. Marsh presented the offer to her personally. Patricia accepted it the same way she had accepted the commendation, with her hands folded and her expression steady, and the quiet understanding that the recognition was real, but the work had always been real too, with or without the title. She put the commendation letter in a frame and hung it in her home. Not in the living room, in the kitchen, where she would see it every morning. Marcus Webb completed his residency. He was, by every account from every attending physician who worked with him, one of the most careful and honest residents the department had trained in a decade. He had a particular quality that the senior physicians noticed. He asked questions before he made assumptions. He verified before he acted. He looked at the badge before he looked at the scrubs. Camille never told him she had read his statement. She did not need to. The quality of his work said everything that needed to be said. Darius Cole was still at his station, still doing his work, still holding his head at exactly the height he chose. Now, here is where the story ends. Not in a courtroom or a boardroom or a hearing room, but on a porch on Delmar Boulevard in St. Louis on a Saturday morning in April, with the smell of coffee and the sound, and of a neighborhood waking up in the particular quality of spring light that makes everything look like it might be beginning again. Camille had driven down from Chicago the night before. She did it every few months, when the weeks had been long and the work had been heavy and she needed to remember where the ground was. She parked on the street, carried a bag of groceries up the stairs, and let herself in with the key she had carried since she was 17 years old. Her mother was already in the kitchen. Adessa Okafor was 72 now, slower in her movements but not in her mind, her hair silver and her hands still bearing the particular texture of decades of latex gloves and institutional soap. She looked at her daughter the way she had always looked at her, with the careful, unhurried attention of a woman who had learned to read people before she read anything else. They sat on the porch with their coffee, and they did not talk about the incident for a long time. They talked about the neighborhood, about the laundromat downstairs that had changed owners twice since Camille was born, about a cousin's new baby and a neighbor's garden, and the way the light came through the oak tree at the end of the block in spring. Then Adese said, without preamble, the way she said things that mattered, "You stayed low." Camille looked at her coffee. "You built high," her mother said, "and you let the work speak." 3 sentences. The same 3 sentences that had governed Camille Okafor's entire life, spoken in the same kitchen where they had first been spoken, by the same woman whose worn shoes and chapped hands had been the first lesson. Camille did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "The boy is doing well. He was discharged after 4 days. His family sent a card to the department." Adese nodded. That was the point. That had always been the point. They sat on the porch until the coffee was gone and the neighborhood was fully awake around them, and Camille felt the particular stillness that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the knowledge that you met it the right way, that you did not become something lesser in the meeting of it, that the work had spoken and the record was clean and the boy was home. That was the architecture of it. That was how it was built. Now, here is what I want to say before we close. What happened in Bay 4 at Mercy General Hospital was not an isolated incident. It was not a single physician's failure. It was the failure of a system that had allowed 11 documented complaints to be filed and then quietly forgotten, that had allowed a man to spend 20 years in rooms where his assumptions went unchallenged, that had allowed a woman with 3 published studies and a directorship and 412 intubations to stand at the head of a gurney and be told, in front of witnesses, to find out where her lane was. This happens every day. Not always in emergency departments, not always with the stakes of a hypoxic 17-year-old, but every day, in offices and boardrooms and classrooms and corridors, there are people who have built something extraordinary in silence, who carry their worth quietly on a badge clipped to their left breast pocket, and who are dismissed in the space of a breath by someone who did not look closely enough to see it. The question is not whether it happens. The question is what happens next. Whether the Patricia Oseas of the world look down at their keyboards or reach for their phones. Whether the Marcus Webbs go home and do not sleep and then walk into the administrator's office the next morning and ask to give a statement with their name attached. Whether the institutions that claim to stand for something actually do, when the record is laid on the table and the vote is called. Camille Okafor did not fight back. She placed the tube. She watched the saturation climb. She let the record be the record, and the record was enough. Stay low, build high. Let the work speak when the time comes. That is the whole lesson. It fits in 9 words. Now, I want to ask you something, and I want you to think about it before you answer. Have you ever been in a room where someone looked through you? Where someone made a decision about what you were worth before you had the chance to show them, and you had to decide, in that moment, whether to speak or to stay and let the work speak for you? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to hear it. Every week on this channel, we find the people the world overlooked and tell their stories, because those stories deserve to be told. If that matters to you, subscribe and share this one with someone who needs to hear it today.